Hello. Yeah, this is Bobby Grow again. I'm using my webcam. It doesn't look very good. It's really grainy, unfortunately. So I have to see how to figure that out now. But I'm just gonna go with it, and hopefully you can look past that. That's it. That's actually rather interesting. I don't know why it's so grainy. Shouldn't be, but it is what it is. Um, this is my first YouTube live, so I wanted to give this a try. And yeah, this unfortunately, I hope maybe when the video is completed, the graininess will go away. I don't know. Maybe I need to move in. It doesn't seem like it should be this grainy, but I might need more lighting, I guess. Anyway, in this vlog, I'm gonna call it. I'm gonna talk a little bit about, a little bit more about provisionism and what their aims are and how they relate to church history as far as how that informs their approach and understanding of theology. And so I think that that's something that's that they say that they engage with church history, but it's really only in a negative posture, and they don't seem to grasp the way that um, the history itself shapes their perspective. And so theologically, I also want to talk a little bit about their lack of um, prolegomena or theological methodology. They don't have one. They, as others have noticed with them as well, they are functioning basically as in, I just said this on a Twitter comment to one of them, with they're like a negation of a negation. So they're attempting to negate an iteration of Calvinism, a 5-point Calvinism, and Calvinism itself, the Calvinism that provisionists are critiquing, essentially is uh, this 5-point Calvinism. And honestly, when you reduce Reformed theology to the 5 points of Calvinism, which that was never the intention of the Synod of Dort, which the tulip is a popular representation of, which developed in the 20th century. Um, but that was never intended to be, the Reformed faith was never intended to be reduced to the 5 points of Calvinism. And so, but this is what the provisionists are critiquing by and large. They don't engage. I think my reference point will be Leighton Flowers and not his understudies, so to speak, with the provisionist perspective guys and this Warren McGrew character and others who follow Leighton on Twitter. So, but Leighton doesn't engage with the history, and this is the most ironic thing to me about Leighton Flowers, is that he doesn't engage with the history of interpretation itself. He doesn't engage with uh, the development of of Calvinism and what eventuated then, say, in the Westminster Assembly, the development of the Westminster Confession of Faith, which is essentially covenant theology. It is covenant theology. It's federal theology. Those are one and the same, by the way. There was some confusion on that with somebody I was talking to on Twitter. So, um, so yeah, Leighton Flowers doesn't engage with um, the history of Calvinism, and Calvinism can be used pejoratively, which is how it was originally used by Lutherans to kind of come at Calvin's followers. Calvin himself, of course, didn't like that designation of Calvinists. Calvinists are something named after him. And you can read about that in Bruce Gordon's book on John Calvin, which I recommend highly. It's a really good biography and gets into Calvin's theology and just the history and his historical setting, the situation where Calvin was situated. So I recommend Bruce Gordon's book on John Calvin in passing here. But in fact, I'll recommend that to Leighton Flowers. He needs to bone up on his research in this area. So that's what I find most ironic about somebody like Leighton Flowers and his followers, who are twice the sons of not hell, but twice the sons of to use that principle, twice the sons of and daughters of being uninformed, and they're one step removed from their teacher who's informed. It's like the blind leading the blind when it comes to Calvinism, vis-a-vis provisionism and Leighton Flowers' understanding of that. So I recommend that to him. I commend Bruce Gordon's book to him. I commend Richard Muller, all of his books, and in particular, he should pick up Muller's 4-volume set, Post-Reformation Reform Dogmatics, and read the whole thing. And then he'll have an informed target that he can critique in a meaningful way. So far, he's not engaging with Calvinism proper. As I think I said somewhere else, provisionists basically are critiquing what I would call Reformed theology improper, or Calvinism improper, because any Reformed person, even of the Westminster sorts, who I also critique, but any of those folks would be wouldn't recognize ultimately the sort of Reformed theology, that Calvinism, a shorthand, that Leighton Flowers says he's critiquing like every day for hours. They wouldn't recognize that because he's not representing, like he says he does, what in fact historical Calvinism actually entails. So Leighton Flowers will refer to John Piper, he'll refer to all the popular Calvinists out there, and he'll say that these are the mainstream, the representatives of Calvinist theology in the 21st century, and which is not true, actually. They're pastors, that's fine. Yes, they're Calvinist pastors. Yeah, their exegetical conclusions are informed by, for MacArthur, just the 5 points of Calvinism. That's what he is. He's a Spurgeonite. He's like a Spurgeon version of Calvinism. So there's different iterations or versions of Calvinism in the history, and then now as well. So, and we can identify those by their characteristics, by the doctrines that they emphasize and things like that. But the broad spectrum from whence Calvinism develops, the 5 points themselves, why there's ever a Synod of Dort in the first place, is directly related to classical or post-Reformation Reformed Orthodox Calvinism theology. And yet Leighton Flowers and his followers demonstrate no knowledge whatsoever of federal theology, of what covenant theology is, and yet they claim to be critiquing Calvinism, but they're really not, like I was just noting. So that's one critique I have of Leighton Flowers and his provisionism. Another critique is that he's very selective. So he will try to engage a little bit with the history, not Reformed history, ironically. He'll go back to Augustine, thinking that he can cut things off at the source, I think is what the premise is for him and his followers in that regard. And so they think that if they can basically poison the well with Augustine, that all subsequent developments following within the Augustinian tradition, as that developed through the history into the medieval period, then into the magisterial Reformation and then the post-Reformed Orthodox period into the present. He thinks, of course, that if you can just cut the tree out or dig the root ball out, I guess, basically, in Augustine, that, of course, the whole thing can just be delegitimized, and we can be done with it, basically, I think is his premise with that. And so he'll rely on somebody like Ken Wilson, who's become a friend, I think, of Leighton's, who, as I've noted before, just got his DPhil at Oxford. He's an older guy. He's a medical doctor, an orthopedist, I think. So yeah, he's a smart guy, but he's in the free grace theology world with Bob Wilkin and Zane Hodges, who's now with the Lord. He was out of Dallas Theological Seminary, but Zane, of course, had within this our little evangelical world. Some of us would remember his little battles with John MacArthur and John MacArthur's his book Gospel According to Jesus, which is the book where MacArthur articulates his understanding of what he even calls lordship salvation, and then Zane Hodges comes along and offers a rebuttal to that, and his book is called Absolutely Free, and which then has come to be known now as free grace theology. And really, free grace theology and Leighton Flowers provisionism are almost exactly the same. Free grace is actually more academically oriented on a biblicist continuum than is even provisionism. Provisionism kind of just seems like this idiosyncratic approach to things that Leighton Flowers himself is making up as a riff on his Southern Baptist traditionalism, which is where he comes from. But there's a lot of overlap between what he thinks about, say, original sin, total depravity, and what free grace people think about that. So anyway, this Ken Wilson comes from the free grace side of things. He teaches, they have like a seminary, and he teaches for them. I think it's like an adjunct. I think all their instructors might kind of be adjunct, except Bob Wilkins. But anyway, I just want to hit that point that Leighton relies solely on the research that this Ken Wilson did in his dissertation on Augustine. And basically, and I haven't read it, so I'm only going, I've listened to a full interview with Wilson, who summarizes and gets into some of the detail of his work in regard to Augustine. But basically, he sees Augustine as somebody who basically smeared Pelagius. That's really what Leighton and Leighton's followers. Let me mention Warren McGrew as well. He's another guy who Leighton likes and has on his podcast or vlog with him getting pretty frequently now. He just had him on a couple days ago with him again. But McGrew, Leighton, they really like this idea that to think along the lines that Wilson presents, that Augustine basically was a salesman, to get like oversimplified. He was a good salesman, and he smeared Pelagius. Pelagius really represented an orthodox line of belief soteriologically before Augustine and Pelagius had their debates and things like that. That's basically the premise. Another premise of, let's call it a thesis of Wilson's work, is that Augustine essentially remained a Manichaean, which is really strange. And Leighton, in echo of Wilson's work, will make that charge against Augustine that he was a Manichaean. Manichaeanism, if you don't know, was a kind of Gnostic, dualistic cult founded by their prophet Mani, and essentially it's just a struggle. It's just like a Gnostic struggle between good and evil as polar forces, one of the other. And Augustine, yes, was a Manichaean himself in his search for the truth. As a young guy, he got hooked into Manichaeanism. He thought Catholic Christianity or Christianity was he didn't like this idea of a corporeal notion of God, which we get, of course, in the incarnation with Jesus. He thought that really it just made his understanding of Christianity completely fallacious at that point, and he found refuge then in the Manichaean philosophy, which saw God as this luminous, this light, this expansive, infinite light source, and of which we would return and be absorbed. Which is basically, yes, it's a Gnosticism. It's part of the Gnostic panoply, I guess, of different expressions. And so, yeah, he found himself in that for 10 years, but he eventually started to see problems with Manichaeanism, and he was exposed to Ambrose, and Ambrose, his teaching and preaching of the word, and Augustine, as he was already having doubts and things about Manichaeanism, he was becoming dissatisfied with it. And then in that perfect storm of ideas and in God's providence, he came and sat under Ambrose's preaching and realized, wow, there's some sophistication to this Christianity thing. And the seed was planted. Of course, his mother was praying for him for years. She was a devout Christian and had only hoped that this would happen for Augustine, and it finally did. And so he became a Christian, and at that point, he renounced Manichaeanism, he renounced the dualism, and he found a ready intellectual source to help him combat Manichaeanism, ironically, in Neoplatonism. And Plotinus would be the teacher most associated with Neoplatonism. Plotinus was very critical of Manichaeanism, and Augustine following and using and deploying the intellectual tools made available to him through Neoplatonism, was able to, for the rest of his life, offer critique of his past Manichaeanism, his past dualism. So Kid Wilson comes along with his research on Augustine, and apparently, I'm gonna have to read his dissertation for myself, but I can go off of what he's said about his dissertation, not just what Leighton says. And he makes it sound like he believes that Augustine remained, as far as ideation goes, a Manichaean his whole life, and that Manichaeanism essentially shaped Augustine's developments in theology, and his thinking about determinism and predestination and things like that. Wilson claims that comes from the Manichaean heresy and not biblical reality. And so that's the way that he attempts to situate Augustine theologically, ideationally, historically, biographically. And then Leighton picks that kind of baton up and runs with it in the popular realms that he speaks into the church. And then Leighton's Flowers, they pick up on what Leighton is saying about Augustine, and they're even less informed. And then this whole kind of morass develops out of that. And it's just an unfortunate thing, but this happens over and over again with different movements and different people within the church's history. We've had all kinds of different I'm trying to think of the word, can't think of it, kind of just these rabbit trails that aberrant is the word I was thinking of, these kind of aberrant um, ideas and developments theologically that happen based upon misinformation in regard to what actually happened in the history. So with reference to Ken Wilson, yeah, he did he did real research on Augustine. He read all of Augustine chronologically, like Augustine wanted people to read him so they could develop along with him. And Ken Wilson claims that because he did that, nobody else has done that. Maybe one other person has done that and read Augustine in the Latin all the way through all of his writings, that he has a unique insight and understanding on Augustine. And based upon that unique insight and understanding, he is making these sorts of claims that Augustine essentially was a Manichaean. He was a great rhetorician and was able to win the day in the ecclesial context of the fifth and late fourth centuries, and sway the church towards his theological project and away from what Pelagius supposedly represented as one voice among many voices, as the claim is, in regard to soteriology and how grace works, and in within that. And um, so yeah, so that is basically in a nutshell, and that's really what it is. That's about the depth of where this goes to with Leighton, with his followers in regard to critiquing uh, Augustine. And in their critique of Augustine, they believe that they have made a way, created a space for us to rethink and re-engage with Pelagius as an Orthodox Christian. And so this becomes problematic because this is not a Catholic approach to Christianity. So when I say Catholic, of course, I'm referring to the little c Catholic. I'm a Protestant. I'm Reformed myself. I'm Athanasian Reformed, evangelical Calvinist, as we have described that, Mike Habitz and myself, in our two edited books that we've done together. So that's where I'm coming from. I'm not 5-point Calvinist. I'm not into federal theology, as most of you know who will watch this. I'm not into covenant theology. Same, like I said, the same difference there. But yeah, the history of interpretation is not, in regard to its Catholicity, is not a friend of these provisionists, not a friend of Leighton Flowers and his followers. And so it makes it almost impossible to have a meaningful discussion with them. And so when I tried to have discussions with Leighton Flowers, or when I tried in the past tense, they always went south because it becomes really almost immediately frustrating. And why do I torture myself like this? I really don't know exactly why I do this. I keep doing this to myself. I mean, I've done this with the with the MacArthurites for years. Back, I started blogging in 2005, and I engaged with them, Phil Johnson, and the Pyromaniacs blog, and for years. But this is basically the kind of the same sort of stuff. It's just now this is provisionism instead of lordship salvation type stuff, and they're about the same. They're about on the same bandwidth as far as their appreciation of the history of ideas and how that informs the way that we arrive at our exegetical conclusions, our theological conclusions. There's a very like nuda scriptura, like a naked scripture approach to things, a very strict biblicism that attends not just Leighton Flowers, but John MacArthur in their approach to interpreting scripture. So, but yeah, so I kind of have, like I said before, I cut my teeth with these MacArthurites online. And now, I've kind of I kind of stayed out of all of that kind of stuff for quite a few years, but Leighton Flowers came onto my radar. I don't know. I think I was on YouTube looking for something to watch on theology on my drive home from work, listen to. And I came across him and I started listening to him a couple years ago. And I listen to him all the I haven't recently because I just can't handle it almost anymore. But I listened to him for about 2 years straight, and now I've kind of come across some of his followers who, like these provisionist perspective guys, Eric and Drew, and this Warren McGrew guy, and some others, but they're the primary ones outside of Leighton. I've actually engaged with these other guys who think I'm really smug. I was just called smug right before I came on here by not one of them, but another provisionist guy who's anonymous on Twitter. Um, he said I'm smug and condescending and patronizing and all of this, but it's kind of hard not to come across that way when you're engaging with people who are completely ignorant of church history, historical theology, and yet then they are making these grand critiques against historical theological systems, and yet they don't really know how those systems developed to begin with. So they focus. So what really ends up happening here with Flowers et al. Is they end up having these kind of like quasi philosophical discussions in the name of biblicism, which is really kind of how evangelical theology works in general. Which is why apologetics is so central to the theological approach to everything. When you try to get deep, there's no Christian dogmatic tradition available for evangelicals, unfortunately. And I grew up in that ecclesial context myself, and it took me $60,000 in student debt to come to the realization that there's way more to the Christian reality that goes beyond uh, the typical evangelical fare, that provisionism is just one iteration of among many that within that broader subculture of evangelicalism. And so, but this is where, because they have this vacuum, these provisionists now, they have this kind of vacuum theologically, because they basically reject the significance of church history. Leighton Flowers says this himself, that he basically believes, why would I believe the opinion of Augustine or Aquinas or Luther, or why would I take them seriously? What makes them any different than my own opinion? I mean, so that's honestly where we're at with somebody like Leighton Flowers. And so because of that, because of his minimalistic understanding of the value of church history and history of interpretation, how that informs the development of all of our ideas, his included. Because of that lacuna, he ends up and his followers end up having these quasi philosophical discussions, and it's just like a constant ringing of the bell every morning, the same bell over and over and again, and that bell basically revolves around an idea, the idea of libertarian free will. That's their thing, and yet they say that this is the biblical. Um, this is what the Bible teaches: is libertarian free agency and free will. And so they'll have these. That's how they basically are trying to critique total depravity. This notion of Augustinian, this demonic, uh, Manichaean understanding of total depravity that has been handed down starting with Augustine, and it all started with him. All of the evils that have been allowed to unfold through the centuries following Augustine and develop from that theory of sin, the doctrine of sin. They believe that that is the source of all the ills that Western theology and Protestant theology and Reformed theology as an iteration of the broader Protestantism that it comes from. They believe that that is the source of everything else that has gone wrong ultimately. And it's like a soteriological problem that they seek, again, to come in and save Christianity from. And yet their approach is not theological whatsoever. And this is what drives me crazy too. And this is why I think I have very little patience when I'm trying to interact with them, which is, why do I try to interact with them? Again, I don't know. That's a mystery to me still, but I do. And so they end up having, yes, these philosophical discussions, not historically informed, and an unwillingness to learn the history and development of Reformed theology, which is really ironic because they're critiquing it all day and all night long, but they're unwilling to actually do the homework required to have a genuine understanding of the development of these ideas. And they reduce things just to the flatlands. Everything is flat for them. And so that's why their whole critique falls flat as well, because they're arguing against a caricature of Reformed theology. They're even arguing against a caricature of the 5 points. They don't even represent those adequately, as far as I can tell, because they weight things so heavily upon total depravity. And yes, that's the T. So that's the first premise in the syllogism known as the tulip. But they get so hung up on one point here or that point, and they think that um, they just believe that the whole thing, if you can get rid of this idea of total depravity, that you can defeat all of Reformed theology. And I find this ironic too, because they themselves as provisionists are functioning out of the sort of dualistic understanding of soteriology that Augustine, while I believe he was not successful, and I do believe that he continued on with a sort of dualistic approach to theology in general and soteriology in particular because of his Neoplatonism. So yeah, I think there's a legitimate reason to critique Augustine on these things. Like I said, I'm the Athanasian Reformer, as I've renamed my blog, and that's specific to Athanasius' theology contra Augustine in regard to his focus on salvation as within an ontological frame. But I don't really want to get into that. I'm just wanting to say, though, that it's ironic that provisionists, they operate with this kind of dualistic understanding of salvation, even more so than Augustine himself did. Yet their thinking on salvation flows from the Augustinian Western Latin tradition. And what I mean by that is uh, it is very soteriologically focused. I mean, Leighton Flowers' own ministry is called Soteriology 101. I mean, that's all he talks about. And that's why I said in the beginning they don't even have a well-developed system. It's purely a negation of a negation, as I was trying to explain earlier. And so within that, then they have this really kind of radical rationalist dualist understanding of salvation in regard to the way that they think about a God from within a God world relation. So in other words, they think of salvation from an abstract understanding of humanity. So, and this is, of course, would be where I'd come in and critique even classical Calvinists, classical Arminians, classical theisms in general, insofar as they do reflect this sort of latent dualism that has been inherited and provided for in and through the Neoplatonism of Augustinianism, and insofar as that has been developed further, ironically, through Thomas Aquinas's assimilation of that with from within, which is this is kind of the irony of how ideas work from within his Aristotelian frame. So we know that Thomas Aquinas, to get going on aside again real fast, we know that Thomas Aquinas synthesized Christian theology through an Aristotelian frame that he was made that was made available to him in his context through the acquisition and translation of Averroes and Avicenna's commentaries on Aristotelian metaphysics, and even on Aristotle himself. So but those categories, basically, those Aristotelian categories, were available to Aquinas in his time. They were kind of the thing. Like Kantianism in the modern period might be the thing, or was the thing. In his day, it was Aristotelianism. So yeah, he then assimilated the Augustinian tradition, which he was a part of in the Latin West, and he synthesized uh, the theological categories that had developed within the Augustinian tradition through this Aristotelian lens, and then that bleeds through then the way that Thomas himself gets received by not Luther. Luther is against Thomas Aquinas. He's against Aristotelian metaphysics. He's against Aristotelian Aristotle's Nicomachean ethics, and that kind of stands at the basis of his reforming movement theologically with his disputation against scholastic theology, which he posted those theses a month before his famous Wittenberg theses. And so that really is, as my mentor Ron Frost really wants to emphasize in his work, that he believes that what Luther was really about was critiquing the theological anthropology that funded the soteriology of the Roman Catholic Church in Luther's day and age. And so he was coming at that because he saw how that impacted everything, the way that humanity thinks about God within a God-world relation, and within the soteriological frame as that was given shape by the ecclesiology and the sacraments of the Roman Catholic Church, and how the church held that over the people, how the church held the people in bondage. Well, Luther understood that, or came to understand that really, and this is where Augustine is present for Luther as well, but contra Thomas's understanding that we're in bondage. We have the bondage of the will, and this of course then that definitely carries through into the post-Reformed Orthodox period. But my broader point here, not to get lost in all these details, which I'm doing right now, is essentially this Augustine tradition gets modulated by Thomas. It works its way past, kind of over Luther, and then drops and over Calvin in a way. Calvin has more of that kind of focus, but he's radically Christocentric in his focus for his day and age, which is he was very unique in his own right in that way. So this kind of Thomism jumps over Luther and Calvin and some others, primarily them, in the magisterial Reformation, and drops into the post-Reformation Orthodox period, where we have characters like Peter Martyr of Vermigli, Ursinus, Olivianus, and many others who, even Melanchthon after Luther, they basically reassimilate this Thomist tradition. And when they did that, though, you end up then, yes, with this decretal understanding of God who relates to the world through decrees, through determinism, through primary and secondary causation, and you have all of this language, all these theological categories present in that. And that's what Leighton and the Provisionists say that they're attempting to undercut by chopping down or gutting or digging out the root ball of Augustine, so to speak, to oversimplify everything here. And so they believe if they can do that, that everything I was just talking about is moot. But the irony, again, is that the Provisionists themselves operate with a theological anthropology that that ends up being abstract, and therefore absolutely dualistic in regard to a God-world-God relationship. And so they think then abstractly I keep using that word because it's important. They're not thinking from the humanity of Jesus Christ. And so this, of course, as an Athanasian Reform, as an evangelical Calvinist person, as a Scottish Bartian, we could say even, but this theme here that I'm going to talk about in a second, the vicarious humanity of Christ, is present in Luther in his theology in a very central way. It's present in Calvin in his theology in a very central way. Even if they didn't have the resources themselves intellectually, theologically, in their situation to be able to develop it the way that then I would argue Karl Barth and some of his forerunners, but Karl Barth in particular, was able to develop this idea of a doctrine of the vicarious humanity of Jesus Christ. And so for me, as an evangelical Calvinist, what I can offer is an alternative to this whole thing, this whole Augustinian discussion, of which the provisionists are a part of, a small part of, but they're a part of now. What I can offer is a critique of all of that through an Athanasian lens, as far as a theological anthropology goes and other things. Basically, we can quit thinking through this abstract dualistic lens of wherein God and humanity appear to be in competition with each other, where they appear to be, as in a provisionist sense, we're just these little monads, these little individuals walking around with our libertarian free will, and if we want to, when God shows up, when we're encountered with the proclamation of the gospel, we can say yes to God or no to God or whatever, and just keep living our lives. That's not a theological way, that's a philosophical way, by the way, to understand a theological anthropology. That's a philosophical anthropology at best that these provisionists operate from. It's dualist in the sense that it's not thinking of humanity in a concentrated way as far as its relationship to God's humanity for us in Jesus Christ. So it's not thinking of humanity from the image of God in the sense that Christ is God's image for us, that Colossians 1:15, that he is the icon of God in the Greek, the icon, just the image of God, and he is a firstborn from the dead. You know, we have all of this theological language embedded within the Pauline epistle in particular, but all of the New Testament. And then that, of course, insofar as the New Testament relies heavily on the Old Testament, of course, the revelation borne witness to therein is continuous. There's continuity between the old and the new and the old in that sense. But so this is why what I am saying I believe is biblical, just because I'm not sitting here and doing a verse by verse exegesis like provisionists say you must do, in the sort of propositionalized way that they do it in, which is what they've inherited also from the higher critical history of religions, naturalistic, deconfessionalized readings of scripture post Enlightenment. They also don't realize that they're not self-critical in that area either, as far as biblical hermeneutics. But since they don't have these things available to them because they just reject them, even when they're made aware of them, like from people like me and others, when they're maybe told, hey, there might be some more depth available to you if you start actually engaging with a history of interpretation and church history and historical theology, instead of just reducing it all to Augustine and saying, when you think church history, you think Augustine, and you think Augustine is like the devil, so then you think all of church history therefore is demonic. Maybe if you quit doing that, you'd have the resources to start thinking actually theologically about soteriology, theologically about anthropology, theologically about theology proper, and then you can offer something fruitful and edifying by way of your critique of Calvinism. You'll have something meaningful to say. You'll have something positive to say in regard to your methodology and the way that you think about Reformed theology and your stance against it. I don't have a problem with provisionists being against classical Calvinism. I mean, I'm against it. I'm not. I've never been a classical Calvinist in my life. The only way I've become Reformed is through this after Bart tradition, through Thomas Torrance, through before Bart and Torrance. Though it was really through Luther, through Richard Sibbes, through my professor's reading of Richard Sibbes, um, through Calvin, and not in a constructive way. So not imbibing and taking on everything that Calvin said, because Calvin has a lot of deterministic thinking in his, and I critique him myself in a chapter I wrote in our last book. I offer a constructive reading of Calvin through the lens of Bart and Torrance, and kind of put them in constructive dialogue, offering some critical critique of Calvin, and then taking some of the good stuff that he had to offer in regard to his Christ-centered focus, and showing how he kind of planted the seeds that were still waiting to be pollinated and brought to blossom, which I think Torrance and Bart have done really well at. And so I think that there is an alternative way to critique Calvinism or anything really, but you have to be willing to understand the value in the Catholic Christian faith, small c Catholic Christian faith, and the riches that God has left his churches with through providing teachers, like Paul talks about in Ephesians 4, that he wasn't going to leave us without teachers. Jesus said he wasn't going to leave us as orphans, that he'd bring the Holy Spirit, and through the Holy Spirit, lift up, raise up pastors, teachers, evangelists, prophets, and the likewise for the edification, for the building of the body of Jesus Christ. And so if you discount all of that, though, and say that, oh, me as Leighton Flowers, my opinion is just as valuable as Augustine or Athanasius, or they're just men just like me, or whatever, whoever, if that's your mindset, and you then can't not appreciate how those particular people, because of their learning, because of God's providence, because of God's desire to lift up teachers, to build up, to edify the church, because of that, if you cannot appreciate that, then you don't have any real positive way to interact or even critique other theological systems, because you are not Catholic at that point. You are not part of the Church Universal at that point. You're not part of the discussion that's been happening for 2,000 years within church history. You're part of the voices in that history, if anything, who are labeled as heretics or heterodox for particular reasons. It's not just, oh, we didn't like Pelagius. We don't like Callistius. We don't like whoever. We didn't like Nestorius or Origen. We don't like Faustus Socinius. There's a reason why these guys and some gals were labeled heterodox or heretics or whatever, and it's because they didn't measure up to the Christological rule of faith, and that's something I want to talk a little bit more about later. So I want to end this. I've rambled on long enough. I see why these guys have people come on with them, or why they have little they can pull up texts that they can read and work through, and they have comments open. People comment, and they take questions and things like that, because it makes it less of a ramble, because it's kind of hard to sit here and stare into a camera like this all by myself and try to talk about these things just off the top without having some of that feedback available that way. So, which changes the dynamic of these kinds of discussions. But again, these are just some more of my thoughts in this area. And I don't think that I know that these provisionists, Leighton Flowers and his buddies, they're just going to keep beating their same drum. Like, they're not teachable, basically, at all. And so that's why I kind of end up being snarky and get terse and come off as smug, I guess. because they do. And I know I'm not, and really it's not even just that. Like, I'm not, it's not just, I'm not trying to be snarky. I'm just, I just have a very little respect, honestly, for people who allow their egos, which is why I see Flowers and everybody almost who follows him, at least the ones who want to argue and things like that, who I've come across, their egos are so inflated that they're unwilling to even entertain anything that I just noted as far as the reality within the history of interpretation, historical theology, and church history. These things are so important if you're actually going to have theological discussions. So if you're just going to be in church, listening to the pastor preach, which that's a whole other frustration I have as far as the way sermons in the evangelical world are crafted and communicated and their content and otherwise. But if that's your world, though, okay. Or if you're just going to be a Bible reader, yes, be a Bible reader. Please be a Bible reader from Genesis through Revelation every day of your life. Please do that. Meditate on it. Please do that. Be caught up within the canonical flow of Scripture and its reality in Jesus Christ. Please allow that to be the way that you live your life. Yes. But if you're going to get into the realm of theology and you're going to be a Catholic Christian in that conversation, you can't wipe it all out and say it's all the devil because it's Augustinian. That you're not part of the conversation, in other words. And as much as you think you're creating a new one or something, you're not, because you're not even engaging with it in a meaningful way, because you've discounted it before you even started to have a discussion with it. What kind of sense does that make? None. So anyway, I better close down here. I do start to get animated and I get a little frustrated about this because it's not a joke to me. None of this is a joke. It's not like I have my position, you have your position. It's not an academic thing to me. It never has been for any theologian worth their salt. None of this has been just flippant or a realm where we can exchange ideas and debate each other, in a kind of sanitized academic apologetic way. That's not what this is for me. This is really personal, actually. And I take it personal when people spit on the Catholic Christian faith that that God in his providence has provided for. We don't have to agree with the whole thing, but you need to be in discussion with it. You need to have a meaningful engagement with this history. And if you're not, then you're not a part of the Catholic Christian faith. You're not a part of that discussion. You might be saved, but only by the grace of God in that sense, as far as sanctification goes. You're not setting yourself up for a growing in the grace and knowledge of Jesus Christ if you simply think that you can reconstruct and recreate the Christian faith in a latter-day way. Okay, so that's the spirit you're working within. The latter-day saints, right? That's the way they think about church history too. So it's a very kind of, when you're non-Catholic, that means you're on a cultic trajectory. You might not you might not ultimately deny the deity of Jesus Christ. You might not ultimately deny the Trinity, which is ironic because those come from the church history that you're spitting on, and saying it's demonic and saying it's all Augustinian and such things. And if you call it Leighton, if you followed your logic through on the Trinity and the hypostatic, the grammar of Chalcedon, the hypostatic union, the homoousios, the consubstantial nature of Jesus in his humanity and his divinity. If you say you would affirm all of that, and yet then you would say that your opinion matters just as much as Augustine or Cyril or Cyprian's or anybody else, Athanasius, anybody else involved in the development of these kind of theological grammars that stand as the bedrock for the historic Catholic Christian faith. You say your opinion matters as much as those guys' opinions, and yet you're standing upon their shoulders as you say it, as you must be hitting them in the face at the same time. It doesn't, that's contradictory. It violates every law of logic, Leighton, which you're so fond of. It violates every law of logic to do that, and yet you continuously do that, and you're not open to critique. I've offered to critique you through my blog posts, and you say you don't like my attitude, you don't like my snarkiness. Well, I'm animated. I'm not snarky. I'm passionate. I'm not snarky. I get frustrated with people like you because you're teaching people as if you're an authority in a realm you know nothing about. So yeah, I get animated and I get frustrated. You better believe it, dude. So um, yeah, I'm challenging you. I challenge all your followers. You won't like this because I don't sound like a butter. I'm not like a little butterfly, and I'm not pretending to be all fluffy and soft. And I love you. And I do love people. I love the body of Christ, and that's why I am so animated because I don't want to see people led astray. And I believe you're leading people astray, Leighton Flowers, and your followers by telling them that Pelagius was an Orthodox Christian, for example, or that Nestorius was an Orthodox Christian. You're leading people astray when you do that, and you're teaching them to think badly about church history because you don't think about it at all. And if you do, you think it's of the devil. So why am I so upset? Why am I so animated? Why do I take it so personally? Because of that. So you won't watch this probably, but maybe some of your followers will, Leighton, and hopefully they can take some of this to heart. They can see my passion. I'm not being snarky in a vacuum. I have a reason, I think, for being upset with what you guys are doing. And so I'll just keep challenging you. I'll do little videos like this. I'll write blog posts sometimes in critique of you all, calling you out because you need to be called out. So, all right, I'm going to end this. Thanks for watching this. I see looks like I've had 2 followers or 2 people watching this. So thank you for watching. And sorry about the quality. I don't know, man. I don't know about what to do about my webcam here. It's brand new. So now I'm kind of disappointed, but maybe that's just what it's going to be as far as quality until I can buy like maybe a good quality webcam and things like that. So, all right. Thank you. It's been about an hour. I went a lot longer than I wanted to. And all right. Thank you, Grace Connection. Appreciate that. And I'll talk to you all next time, whenever that is. I'll try to do these every now and then. It won't always be about provisionism. That's not what I don't really like focusing on provisionism so much, but I feel like they need to be called out. So, and they're on my radar. So they're on my radar. So it's hard for me to not think about them anymore. And I don't think any other kind of academically oriented guys are going to really engage with the provisionists, except their handpicked ones that they like. So I'll be over here ranting and raving as I have time to do that with reference to the provisionists. So I love y'all. Thank you. The Lord's blessings to you. Good night.